Hi Nilesh,
Hi, Camille.
how are you? We're just
Oh,
waiting for people to join. I think it should be like,
so-
30 seconds to a minute because we're seeing people join in. But I'm so excited to have you here. Um,
I'm so glad we can do this.
yeah, exactly. I think if you can just like adjust the camera a little bit, like
Yeah.
I'm seeing more of the, yeah. Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is SAAG Chats episode 11. I'm joined by, thank you for that question. I will address it after this live. Um, I'm joined by SAG senior editor Neilesh Bose, who is a very valued member of the team and an original member of the team. He is also an associate professor of history and Canada research chair in global and comparative history at the University of Victoria in Canada. He's a historian of modern South Asia, and his interests include many things, actually, but the ones that he's written down in his bio include colonialism, decolonization, post-colonial history, nationalism, literary history, and intellectual history. And even though that sounds like a lot, I can promise you that he's actually interested in far more than just that. So, um, you know, specificity is not Nilesh Bose's strong suit. Let's just say that. Um, but I'm really excited to be talking about this incredible new book that has just come out. It's called, I can't reverse the screen for you. Actually, I think I might be able to. I'm going to reverse the screen so you can see. Are you seeing it? No, you're not. Okay, well, I can't do that. But this is the cover of the book. It's called South Asian Migrations in Global History, Labor, Law, and Wayward Lives. And we're here to discuss that today with the editor of the book that contains many contributions from people. And it's really, a fantastic book because it's not as much as one would think that it centers on the subcontinent and the migration patterns within the subcontinent. It runs as far afield as to the creation, to the, historic creation of diasporas and peoples and indentured labor from Fiji to East Africa to the Caribbean. And so I think one of the wonderful things, one of the greatly best places to start off with is about the genesis of this book. Nilesh, I'd love you to tell me about I know this book started off at a workshop at the University of Victoria. So what was the significance of that workshop? What happened and why was it held there?
First, before I address that question, which I will very quickly, want to thank you for hosting this discussion in this august forum here. And I just want to mention one thing. This is a time of terrible news all around. But relevant to this work, we just received news about 4 days ago that Ronnie Govender, the great playwright and activist in South Africa, had passed away. And it is a real marker of time, something I may speak of later if there is a chance
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
But about the book and the workshop. So how did it come about? Well, before in 2017, I and others that held this workshop, there had been discussions of migration and indigeneity and indigenous peoples in the context of Canada in various public fora vis-a-vis Indian migrants. There was one discussion that I had attended about how to include the place of Indian migrants into a permanent exhibition for the Royal BC Museum. And this had initiated a whole range of conversations about how to study migration through which kinds of narratives of settlement, narrative of assimilation, narratives of alienation, as well as how to think about Asian migrants either as settlers or as contributing to aspects of settler colonialism. And so these kinds of discussions led me and others to create a workshop here in Victoria, a site that is, in the present day at least, constantly scrutinized for its various inhabitants, whether there are stories of inhabitants here who go back thousands of years, indigenous peoples on this island, as well as different kinds of migrants who have entered this space. So it is a very live and dynamic site for the discussion of migration. And another issue that we focused on is how to think about the world of South Asian migrants, where we have comparatively more, whether it is empirically documented work or conceptual advances on, let's say, migrations from China to various parts of the world, the African diaspora and African migrations. We have comparatively less that situates South Asia within global migrant contexts, and in particular from the early 19th century onward. So a little bit about that will lead into the book. What were the kinds of discussions that occurred at this workshop? Well, primarily discussions by historians, but we foregrounded historians who work in different parts of
Yeah.
South Asian migrant lives. So Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, the Himalayas, the Northeast, which did
Yeah.
not enter into the book, but a very important area. And then discussions of the Indian Ocean as sites of migrant lives. And I think that was really the push. And then finally, I'd say that another aspect of that workshop was invested in thinking about methodological and conceptual insights that we wanted to bring to the table. And one of our speakers, Gayatri Bahadur, delivered a keynote address in which she discussed the lived experiences of studying migration from being within a migrant site, and in her own life and her own stories, as well as her own research. She explored this particular point, which is often seen through, as I said, African diasporic and African American and African broader migrant context or other contexts, rarely from the South Asian migrant experience.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating that you bring up Gayatri Bahadur, because we've had discussion with her in SAAG as well, and I was very intrigued by that, the suggestion in the acknowledgements, really, that Gayatri started this conversation about indentured slavery, and essentially this migration of labor into what is modern day Guyana, but into Indo-Caribbean more broadly, and this brought on engagement with scholars who are extremely well known, such as Saidiya Hartman, etc., etc. So I guess one question that I have is, what is the before and after? So what is in terms, how would you characterize the field of South Asian studies on migrations before this particular intervention is made? And I think, and then the after, like, the many scholars who got interested in this, and I'd like to sort of dovetail this with the question as to, like, the sort of cultural way we talk about immigration and migrants, etc., etc. I mean, one of the most fascinating and sad and strange things is that the Western diaspora, if you count the immigrants in the US, the UK, and Canada, I mean, they're about like 1% or 2% of the South Asian population writ large, if you think about it, and yet they have this seemingly outsized impact on culture as we think about it in terms of diasporic South Asians. But you seem to be very much reorienting towards like diasporas with many pluralistic forms. So I'm just kind of wondering about that before and after.
Yes, so great. Those are wonderful points. I'd say there are two, and one is much more specialized within the world of historical discussions and for historians, and another, I think, speaks to the latter point of the popular realm of how we talk about diasporas, migrations, and migrants. So the first, about the specialist discussions, I would say that before this moment, it was more accepted or perhaps assumed that the histories of migrations would follow from the histories either of nation states, so some sort of history of assimilation into a state, or would follow from models we know in the Atlantic world,
Yeah.
models drawn from the broad history of transatlantic slavery, abolition, wage labor, and integration into a state. This model does not really tell us a lot about how South Asian migrations have worked historically or in the present day in much of, I would say, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, much of Africa and the Caribbean.
Yeah.
They simply don't help us there. Um, but it is a challenge. It is not so much as you mentioned in some of the other conversations. The field here is not an easy open and shut field. It is
Yeah.
not as if now we know, okay, now we can do it. This kind of work takes multi-sited, long research, access to many kinds of sources, archives, and at times languages. So it is a field that is being put together that is pushing at the boundaries of accepted historiography, whether in the Atlantic or whether in any particular place. So I'd say that's what, for the historians today, that is what might be taken away from this.
Mm.
For the popular realm, I'd say that the way that people speak about migrants in the popular is sometimes dominated by those in, let's say, overrepresented spaces that are inversely in relation to the actual proportion of population, as you were mentioning. So there's a very dense and long-standing relationship in the Caribbean, Eastern, Southern Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific to South Asia, as well as parts that are often not talked about, West Africa too, that do not bring to the forefront easy to package stories. They don't bring to us either stories only of ready-made integration success, however we may define that, nor do they bring to us stories that can be packaged in the global north easily. So I'd say for the popular realm, it behooves us to confront these stories and these experiences in ways perhaps that something like the avant-garde, wherever that may take us, might be able to capture outside of any ready-made version of what it is to be a migrant.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So it's what I find really interesting about what you just said is that, I mean, of course, it is a field that is forming, etc. But in terms of the sorts of molds and frameworks that have been established in global history, for a while, that it is now beginning to sort of disturb, because you refer to it as an undisturbed framework, and I think it seems that disturbing the framework as opposed to toppling the framework seems very much the sort of emphasis we're talking about here. I'd like to ask a bit about what is it about global history that both hamstrings us as historians and helps us perhaps understand these very vast, both in geographical and temporal terms, histories, right? Like what about global history, in terms of its practice and its methodology, has been both holding us back, but also as a lineage that we should perhaps continue. And I think the entire book really speaks to this. But I guess for our audience, I'd love to know like a potted version of that answer.
Great, yes, and I hope for those who are interested, will take up these questions as you've just articulated them, because that indeed was the basis of the early conversations around this book, which is to say that global history is an opening in certain ways, but it is also potentially very limiting. So what are the openings, or why would somebody look to global history? Global history can be defined in many different ways. There isn't any, let's say, scientific way of understanding it. It isn't one or the other. It isn't simply what is not local. It is rather a framework that may take us away only from local or national histories. And that is where there is an opening, precisely because in many parts of the world where South Asian migrations have had dense and lasting impacts, the local historiographic traditions, the archives, as a question you brought up in other contexts, or the popular discussions seem to have no place for understanding or confronting or exploring the role of South Asian migrations and South Asian peoples in those areas.
Yeah.
So the global history move, the turn toward thinking outside only any bounded space, is what helps us place figures like Taraknath Dash, Pandurag Khankoje, and so
Yeah.
many others, Gayatri Bahadur's great-grandmother, in a context where we are not simply quibbling with the local or the non-local. We're not simply saying, please include this. We're trying to think beyond whatever a nation state may have to offer. But the limit to get to that issue, which is serious and it is an important issue, is that most global historical frameworks have taken the Atlantic world as either an explicit empirical guideline or some kind of implicit model that often is assumed. So the assumption may be that those who migrate from places outside of their own point of origin are identifying with an area somewhere else, are assimilating into that other society, are embodying that society, or that their movements may simply be from point A to point B. One of the issues captured in this work to some degree is that migration is not only from one place to another. This is an easy point to identify, but it is rarely appreciated within the historical literature, and it's very difficult to capture. The prologue by the senior scholar and stateswoman, we could say, Uma Dupelia Mestri, mentions this issue with a work of hers about the figure Latiman, who appears in all these archives under different names, but for whom rarely are scholars actually concerned. And so this is an issue that is difficult to manage, but it is something that we, I think, after this work, hopefully will think more about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I actually really love that answer. I think it's a really, I wanted to say it was diplomatic towards the beginning, but now I feel like it's like it's the actual answer. It's how I'd like to think about it. I'd like to talk a little bit about how a lot of these histories that we've been reading. I mean, you bring up Sugata Bose's, sort of seminal narrative early on in the introduction, and you go on to, discuss a lot of the, perhaps newer work, not so new, but like Indian Ocean histories, for instance, that for instance by Sunil Amrit, that are sort of knitting together these histories of disparate peoples by way of many types of things, including legal regimes and labor and the sorts and the disparate kinds of lives and hierarchies that people fell into across the vast expanse that the Indian Ocean covers. But in a sort of interesting way as well, and this is anecdotally sort of interesting because I'm working with Sunil on a list which is on Indian Ocean history. So we're doing this a lot, and it was funny because Sunil and I were discussing this, and he was just like, I had this sort of frustration with ocean histories. Well, I was just like, I don't fully understand why they're called ocean histories anymore, other than the fact that they take place across the regions spanning an ocean. And he's just like, that's a good question. Like, where is the ocean in Indian Ocean histories, right? And so we're kind of like plumbing this question as to, okay, well, what are the actual ecologies and landscapes that we're talking about, et cetera, et cetera. But my question to you is sort of like this, right? The conventional narrative of transatlantic trade and the narratives of slavery and trade and migration from, say, Europe to South Asia and back, right? That conventional narrative has been running for quite some time now, and there is a certain connection that it has not just to global history but also to other traditions in subaltern history, in European like colonial histories as well as a great deal of Marxist historiography, right? So when we're talking about that lineage, which stretches so far into so many different fields, how difficult do you think it really is to like sort of bring scholars from these very different areas of history into this broad ambit, and then have them be talking about migration? I mean, technically, I think what I'm asking is sort of like a logistical question. Wait, how did you even do this workshop, right? But like, it's also like, how do you get scholars of such different varieties to sort of bear in on these questions?
Yes, a very important trenchant issue because I think that the state of the field, the state of the world, compels us to think beyond received categories and subfields, yet the incentive and the access and ability to do so is limited.
Yeah.
So this is a tension somewhat like the tension between the need, there will always be a need to invest further into local histories, and the work is intended in a way to shine the light on that, but in the context of some sort of framework. And so I think the workshop's presence was made possible by the fact that many scholars, I'd say junior scholars, as well as scholars who perhaps may see themselves outside of whether we want to call them nationalist or whether we want to call them inherited traditions. Those who see their work outside of those inherited traditions often gravitate toward something like this, the study migration. I don't think migration is the end or the only kind of topic that could do this, but it certainly speaks to an aspect of the history of globalization that would bring in scholars of labor, labor histories, as you had mentioned, legal historians, as well as the kinds of cultural historians who are interested. And there are such pockets within our field of history, but also, scholars outside of the actual field. And I think that's another issue that the book does address without going into it in great detail, that part of the work that has to be done must be done outside of the academic field of history, though the academic field is indispensable to this mission.
Yeah, I actually love that, because that allows me to ask the question that I really wanted to ask next, which is that to what degree are we looking at an expansion of the traditional historical method, right? So it feels to me like the impact of legal histories, oral histories, ethnographies looms large throughout this book, right? And I think to a large degree, you've spoken about how we really do need to sort of increase the ambit, but I kind of want to like just sort of go down the line and sort of ask you, let's start with legal history, like and legal studies and the impact that they've had on this discourse on either globalization or global histories. Like, how has legal history, especially recently, really aided, particularly this volume as well, but in general?
Yes, I mean, as you know, and as you are implying here, I mean, legal history is a very vibrant subfield of South Asian history and of various histories today, which shows that those who are interested in working in areas that are multi-sited and that push at the boundaries of received traditions turn to often legal histories, sources, and debates. I would say that there are so many aspects of legal history in the broader field of South Asia that are very important. I'll name a few. I mean, there is the very important work of Mitra Sharafi and family history. And family history is, at some level, a history that defies histories of state and histories only of an archive. There is a wonderful tradition of law and iconography, and the way that legal spaces shape processes of recognition and visual culture. And there is, of course, a great tradition in the study of legal pluralism, which we know from within South Asia and South Asian history, but also as a way to connect South Asia with other parts of the world. And the final point that I'd mention here is that with legal history, those who study legal history have long known that the regulation of migrants was a fairly significant part of the history of colonial India. It is a very significant part of the history of independent South Asian nation states. And some of the recent work, Radhika Mangia, for example, Jeremy Martins, Jonathan Claren, all of them focus on this legal historical angle into the regulation of migrants, and this is in the last decade or so. This kind of work has pushed those of us who care about the cultural histories, the aesthetics, and the various layers of the migrant experience to think with and throughout legal spaces when we think about migration. One last point about that is that the historical implications of, let's say, the 1922 Indian Immigration Act, which formally abolished indentured labor, but recalibrated the ways that migrants are understood by the Indian state. This has enormous implications for the late 20th century and today with the pandemic. And it is something that I think scholars are increasingly thinking about. So it informed this book, and hopefully the book will inform those who focus fully, on that aspect of history.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking a great deal about Marina Martin's. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly.
Yes.
Marina Martin's wonderful, contribution in this volume, which really grapples with the sort of legal construction of the Indian South African, which is again not the sort of question that you get to see people grapple with very often, and that's the sort of wonderful thing about this book, that you're in 1 second you're in Fiji and the other you're in South Africa. I love that. But in terms of like the construction of the Indian South African, one of the most the thesis that I found incredibly intriguing there was that the construction of the Indian South African was also foreclosing a broader inquiry as to who is Asiatic, right? And insofar as the construction of a certain South Asian identity in a diaspora where migration has occurred, is being concentrated upon, it is also situated within the broader identification of continental Asia, right? So, in a sense, I really loved that article's way of using law and politics to sort of frame not just the consequences of migration from the Indian subcontinent, but also their separation or the category confusion that arises from their Asiatic neighbors, right? And what is Asiatic? To what degree do you feel like unexpected categories and category confusion was a through line through this book?
Yes, so this brings to light an important issue that I actually is uncanny that this is all happening, but this was an issue that I had mentioned when we had this workshop, and there was interest in actually fully following this thread, which appears in certain parts of, I think, this history, not necessarily in all parts, but in North America, the term Hindu has a complex concept history, and we see today in different parts of North America that the term Hindu is used in various ways, deployed for various purposes. In the era of the late 19th and early 20th century, the term did not mean what it means today in the discourse of migration. It had a specific reference drawn from the world of ethnological literature that the United States and Canada's border officials were reading
Yeah.
about Hindu as a so-called ethnological category that would have included members of all different religions in India.
Hmm.
And this whole world of category confusion is being challenged by the very people who are present in the United States and Canada in the 1900s to the 1950s. And then after the 1960s, the term undergoes a radical change. The term Asiatic in South Africa is rarely used today. It has a deep resonance of the time period of the creation of the Union of South Africa of 1910, which was a collaborative white settler state that was born out of various moments of conflict and war between Boer forces and the British forces there in the late 19th century. And they would have had a very close relationship with this term, Asiatic.
Yeah.
And because of histories of labor, histories of indenture, and histories of diplomacy, the whole categorical reasoning behind using that term starts to transform in the early 20th century. And by the early 1960s, which I believe is mentioned in this book, 1961, Indian South Africans are considered citizens of South Africa,
Yeah.
and several decades of efforts at deportation ended. And with it also the term Asiatic was retired. So this kind of history is something that I think could be done in a larger larger scale with other regions of the world.
Yeah, 100%. But going from the larger scale that you're just talking about right now, so we just we touched on legal history and its impact on the field, and I kind of want to go now more towards the more what one might term more micro as scalar aspects of history, and that is the effect of biography. And I'm just curious and would love for people to hear just the story of Taraknath Das, which is the chapter that you write. In the book, and who's this Indian nationalist and political activist whose story has somewhat been, is very important to understand a particular slice of time in the U.S.-Canadian negotiations of identity and migration towards North America. And is particularly during wartime periods and interwar periods. So I'd love for you to sort of give a little bit of what is that biographic history of this very important person to understand.
Great, thank you. And I, as you may suspect, I can talk about Taraknath Das for a while, so I'll try to resist indulging. But he's a fascinating character to me, and he hasn't received his proper historical due yet, in my view. And the goal, before I speak about him a little bit, I'll just say that the goal in the book, which includes a biographical sketch of Pandara Kankoje, who spent 30 years in Mexico from the 1920s to the 1950s, and a life sketch of Shantamani Govindan, who was born at the end of indenture in South Africa, lived her whole life there, and rise and fall of apartheid. The goal was not to simply place people like Dash in the context of some kind of extraordinariness or sensationalism or something that is beyond. But is to think about how lives like theirs that defy easy placement into anything predictable help us understand, as you say, help us understand the time. So Dash, he in the beginning of his life, is quite similar to others in the nationalist circles of Bengal in the early 1900s. And he is reared in a way in nationalist organizations, and then finds his way into Japan in 1905, like many others who were inspired by Japan and also saw Japan as a model after the Russo-Japanese War for the training of nationalists to fight against the British Empire. Didn't have a very good time there, like many Indians who were there in 1906 and 7. And then he leaves in 1906 on a ship across the Pacific, like many other Indians, and enters Seattle in early 1907. And at that time, there weren't that many South Asian migrants in North America of his type. There
Yep.
were quite a few from the Punjab in particular who were in the Pacific coast, but those like him who had a formal, in a sense, nationalist education, there were not as many. And he immediately finds his way through working in odd jobs in the Pacific Northwest. He finds his way across the continent and enrolls in Norwich University in Vermont, which is a military school. And he's there to learn, like he was in Japan, different methods as well as modalities for understanding nationalist organization. And he does very well in school until they figure this out, and then he is ejected under various dubious circumstances, which my forthcoming biography will fully clarify. But he leaves, and then he goes back to the West Coast, finds his way into Seattle through networks that he had made when he first arrived, and he enrolls in the University of Washington, Seattle. This is 1910, 1911.
Right.
He gains a master's degree, and he works at odd jobs, and then he applies for citizenship, and he does so 3 times. He gets it on his 3rd try, 1914, at the start of the war, and he is present at almost all of the various important moments in this history. The starting of the other party in California, and then everywhere there is some sort of case. He's an interpreter. He works as an interpreter for trials in Oregon and Washington and California. And as you implied there in your opening, he is arrested, and then he is tried alongside 16 others in a case that was popularly called the Hindu-German conspiracy case in 1916. And he is imprisoned for about a year in Leavenworth, Kansas. One of the first, in his terms, he saw himself as a political prisoner, one of the first Indians to be as such in the United States. And then after he leaves in 1918, leaves prison, he marries a woman who would have been considered a white woman, and she, because of the Cable Act in the United States, lost her citizenship because he was ineligible for citizenship, even though he had been a citizen from 1914 onward. It is a complicated moment in the 1910s and 20s for citizenship and race.
Right.
He leaves after he marries her in 1925. He happens to, on the way, sit in the Library of Congress for 2 years and writes a PhD at the Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and then leaves. And then he lives between different parts of Europe with his wife, who had existing networks in Europe. He had pre-existing networks with Indian revolutionaries there, and comes back in the 30s, teaches in places like American University, also in Columbia. He also undergoes an interesting transformation where he becomes much more attuned to what we now would call Hindu nationalism, very much against the idea of Pakistan as it is being developed in the interwar period, and goes back to India in 1952 and gives a series of lectures in Calcutta, basically extolling the virtues of the United States, and is roundly opposed by most of his audience members there, bringing to light the suspicion that many have had that he was maybe on the payroll of the United States at some point, and that could be the case. And then he dies in 1958 in New York. well, this could be what many of his opponents who
Right,
said when he came to Calcutta and said the United States is a beacon of freedom for the world,
right,
and asked how he was able to keep his citizenship and obtain that
right.
PhD in 1925, raised questions. We don't know yet,
That's true.
but just a few more things I'd like to say is that his life, or the life of Kankoje, who spent 1924 to 54 in Mexico, or Shantamani Govindon, who was born after indenture, lived her whole life in South Africa. They deserve the kind of study that does not render them only an oddity to
Hmm.
the world of history that we know of. The definition of globalization in our world is an ongoing set of conversations. Some link it to finance capitalism, some link it to the end of the Cold War, some, as this book presents it, links it to the beginning of the post slavery era of the 1830s onward. Wherever we put our gaze, these individuals deserve a place in that discussion. And I'd say that one last point about figures like Dash, and this is bolstered by an insight that one of the attendees of that workshop had mentioned, Gajendra Singh, who works on aspects of the history of the Punjab and
Right.
military history and the Ghadar movement, mentioned that many of the people who were involved in these movements, like the Ghadar Party, became constructed as heroes later.
Yeah.
And for me, people like Dash are not exactly heroes. They're not neither villains either. They're not redemptive figures. And someone like Dash internalized much of what he learned from imperialism of his time. But that does not mean that we shouldn't study people like him.
Yeah. It's interesting because I don't know if other people use this term, but I use it because I find it incredibly useful. Whenever people are giving like are talking about like biographical histories, I like to like parcel it into like, is it a form of biographical emblemism, which is, I'm not sure if it's that word, if that's a word, but or biographical exceptionalism, in that are they like exceptional in some form? And it seems to me like this is very much some form of emblemism, but it's not as cut and dried. But you did drop something that drop knowledge about something that I did not know, which is that I didn't know that you're writing a book about this. Like I didn't know
Yes,
this
yes.
forthcoming biography about Dash coming. That's
Yes, and
fascinating.
it draws upon all of these conversations that we've just been having,
Yeah.
and also it is aimed at offering a bit of a meditation on the last point, that
Right.
biography is not only about including. We can
Exactly.
include so many more figures, more than we could ever imagine. But what does it do to retrieve? What does it do for us now to retrieve such
Mhm.
figures? Something that Gaitra also, is engaged in a study of. I could mention Samia Khatun's work, Australia Nama, which is about the history of Indian migrants into Australia. Also, though, about reflecting on what that means to do history in Australia. And
Yeah.
I think that for the histories of North America and the histories of South Asian migrants anywhere, these are more sites of reflection as opposed to, as you say, biographical
Yeah.
emblemisms or exceptionalisms.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I find that fascinating. I mean, I find him a fascinating figure in general, and I guess the question that I think all interesting biographical emblemisms always arise in like the general reader is, how many people can we figure out in such a manner, right? And this sort of brings me to the point about like, um, how did you get to Dash, for instance, right? And what is it about the, and I'm going to try to connect this with the point about archives, and made in the book, made in the introduction of the book, about the opening of state level archives, and especially in the post-war period, and especially in the post-colonial period, you see this opening up of archives, and that opens up this domain for a lot of histories that could not have taken could not have been formed as before, but now they are. And also like the periodic sort of openings of Indian archives, for instance, has enabled research that would have been difficult to do a decade prior, right? Um, so I guess I'm sort of wondering, like, what is the how much dependence is there on the state level, on the state archive, especially and in a difficult project which is trying very much to be anti-statist in its methodological aims. Um, and secondly, what is the sort of like you know archival silence that sort of allows biographies like those of Dash to be difficult. I mean, those are difficult endeavors, and I think they're difficult for a particular reason, which is that it's very difficult to find material and not enough archival granularity on figures like Dash. So I'd love to like connect both the sources of the book, but also your own sources.
Yes, so those are big questions, and I hope to be able to come back when I have more to offer. But I do have some things to say about everything that you've mentioned. One is that it depends on where we want to take the kind of insights that, even reflecting on the archival impulses and the archival limits, can take us into spaces of professional historical reflection.
Yeah.
It might take us into the world of popular fiction, historical fiction, popular writing, and so that would depend. So when it comes to something like what Gayatri has done, I think the aim, as I read her work, is to bring out what is indispensable archival work, but not only for historians. The goal of a work like hers is to reach an audience outside of the professional historian or the student of history. And I'd say that to some degree, Samia Khatun's work also aims to do that. For Dash, I think that though one may be, I'm not necessarily saying that a work must be anti-status, but I think that one has to be careful and conscious of what archives are. There's never, as you know very well, I mean, there's never a neutral space from which we might retrieve data, but it is about who we wish to address. And so I'd say that I would want three major audiences to be addressed. One is are people, like in this context here, to understand the level of texture of a migrant like Dash in an era when migrants like him were not really on the radar of established nation states like the United States in the manner that we think today. So there's a reflection on a historical moment of difference. He was on the radar in terms of state surveillance quite heavily. But the kind of presumptions we make about an individual through archival data, no. So we don't have what we might have for other figures of American history of his time. For the person interested in South Asian migrants, this allows us some sort of insight into not so much his life, his subjectivity, but his relationship with the world, how he understood, let's say, one of the works that he wrote in 1922 is India in World Politics. And it was based not only on research and life in a library, but it was also born out of his experiences in the Pacific Coast, at times with the different jobs that he had and applying for and not receiving citizenship, but claiming that he was of Caucasian origin, something that, of course, Bhagat Singh Thind also claims. And at that time, which is in the 1910s, this is a kind of layer of engagement that is
Yeah.
radically different than what we see, in later times. So it gives us a window into that, and that is where I would want the kind of engagement to occur. Layers of historiographical conversation that are not, available often, as well as a reflection on a life that otherwise would not be seen. So one last point on that, which I do make, I believe, briefly in this work, is that in the recent decades now, in the context of the United States after 9/11, there are all sorts of spaces in which the U.S. state works with the term that May and I use as the impossible subjects of the contemporary, uses figures, works with such figures
Mhm.
to infiltrate spaces of migrant presence. And in the
Yeah.
case of the late, let's say, 2000s and 2010s, the world of South Asian Muslims in spaces like New York is a specific space, but this would apply to many other spaces. Dash is a kind of person who tells us about this history in a way that really no one else does. He's at the inside and outside of multiple worlds at once. And so that is what I hope to bring out. Again, it doesn't tell us the kind of subjectivities that other kinds of histories can. But that, again, as Gayatri and others have confronted, it makes us ask different kinds of questions with our material. It's not really ending a historical conversation. It's just putting it into a different direction.
Yeah, yeah. So as a quick thing about IGTV, which is that like if it goes over an hour, then you can't save it. So we only have like a few more minutes. But I kind of want to like as a sort of important, ending note for this conversation. I think it's interesting. So this book is coming out. It came out. When did it come out exactly? What was the release date?
December 2020.
2020. All right. So okay, I thought it came out in January 2021, but it comes out in in the middle of a pandemic, which is obviously not planned because you had um, been working on it since the workshop in 2017, and at the time that it comes out, and at the present moment, right? What do you what do you sort of like want readers to sort of be taking away from it in terms of the contemporary moments and places that they might be right now? And does it? I feel like for my part, and this is again just my part, that it really, you know, migrant anxiety is an affective register that is being hit upon on so many temporal scales in this book, and it is certainly something that we can, we know because we experience them ourselves, and we have friends and family who experience them ourselves. But in the sort of like post-pandemic or during pandemic world, I almost feel like we're going to see migrant anxieties in a very different sort of mode. And especially as an environmental historian, I feel like we're going to start seeing migrant anxieties take on a fever pitch that is perhaps unprecedented. Um, so, what do you think the lessons? I mean, this is a really trite, like, fifth grade question to sort of ask, but it's I feel like it's important just because I feel like our anxieties are going to be like at maximum fever pitch. Like, what do you think about like broader discourse on migration and how the book will interact with readers in the present moment? Like, what would you want for that to be? Yeah.
Yes. Well, first of all, yes, I fully agree with the point that you made. And I'd end by saying that what I hope that this book does in the context of the pandemic is to point more and more considerable attention onto the politics of human migration in the past as a way of retaining an emphasis on aspects like coercion, power, conquest, and dispossession
Yeah.
outside only narratives that present aspects of migration as being a part of nature or as being a
Mm-hmm.
part only of
Mm-hmm.
something that can be accessed via a conception of the history of science. So, for example, there is a line in the world of the history of migration that links human migration to other kinds of migrations, other sorts of species. And there is a historiography around seeing human movement like other kinds of movements of other species. And a
Right.
recent book by Sonia Shah, The Next Great Migration, argues that
Yes.
migrations of humans are just like other species. They're biological imperatives. One could say they're adaptations to environments. But thinking in this way often has the danger of losing sight of the politics of coercion and conquest that then hide other aspects of the history of migration.
Mm.
Now, it is more the opening to a conversation between those environmental historians, scholars of the history of science, and scholars of the history of migration that, though it was not included in this work, I hope the work will spur more people to conduct and to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. I just want to say congratulations, Nilesh. I think this is it's a marvelous work, and it's the kind of work that wants me to that I really wish I could have been at that workshop. And I'm just like, oh God, why wasn't I there? I wish I could have been. And just because, like, I can imagine the conversations happening in real person time. But thank you so much for having this. I really need to save this before Instagram no longer allows me to. So. Thanks so much, Nilesh. We'll talk soon, obviously. And thank you so much for taking out the time.
Thank you.